Well, hello, Cam.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining and taking the time. Really excited to speak with you and to learn about all of your impactful work. But before getting into that, can you please talk about what inspired you to work in the climate field?
Yeah, definitely. So I had a background in biotech market development and economic development in South Louisiana, and through that became very passionate about both the opportunities and numerous challenges facing a region such as that. And I got engaged with the emerging offshore wind industry there and saw an opportunity to join Greater New Orleans, Inc., the economic development organization for Southeast Louisiana, to really advance that work. And so I was really attracted to its alignment on really touching a lot of different challenges and opportunities for the region that I was becoming passionate about.
Very cool. And is there anything in particular that directed you towards focusing on energy and innovation in climate action?
Yeah, I think of the various climate and environmental risks facing South Louisiana, a lot of them have a common thread through its hydrocarbon dominance. Being a historical 6-decade producer of petrochemicals really connects greatly to coastal challenges, an eroding coastline of 20,000 square miles since 1930. And then that's really where a lot of people live. It touches our environmental and fishery industries that also sustain a lot of the communities in South Louisiana. So energy is something that has sustained the regional economy for a while, and with that became an ever important area of focus as we broach this energy transition at large.
Very interesting. And now transitioning to some of your work at GNO, would love to hear about any major initiatives that you're currently working on and any particularly exciting innovations that you feel will be really impactful and ubiquitous in the climate field in the near term.
Yes, certainly. So our largest initiative that really crosses sectors and also the public-private stakeholders that are going to be necessary to carry any energy transition work forward in South Louisiana is our H to the Future initiative. This was founded with 25 partners from Lake Charles, so Southwest Louisiana, to New Orleans, Southeast Louisiana, with a vision for green hydrogen sort of being a silver bullet of a solution relevant to directing our renewable energy opportunities towards industrial decarbonization, where our emissions and energy consumption is highest. And there's a number of innovations that are going to be pretty necessary to carrying that work forward, right? So offshore wind is something that has tremendous resource potential for the Gulf, identified by the National Renewable Energy Lab. But we have those lower wind resources, hurricane risk, and softer soils that require a whole next generation of offshore wind technologies to unlock that market. However, in the meantime, with these first-tier markets on the East Coast, we see a lot of Louisiana suppliers, like our vessel operators, being called to make it happen up there. So there's also that near-term supply chain opportunity. Offshore wind's pretty key as a scalable renewable resource for that green hydrogen proposition, because we need something that's immense and scalable and can really direct sufficient renewable capacity to those industrial operations. And why green hydrogen for industry is that ammonia, for example, is something that's heavily produced in our region. It's key to fertilizers, which really sustain our agricultural sectors across the nation, across the globe. And you can't electrify ammonia. You're not buying electric bags of fertilizer. Hydrogen is that core feedstock there. We're also seeing that the same for steel and other manufacturing sectors that are not just in Louisiana, but heavily concentrated here. Renewable energy capacity is also going to be pretty key for a lot of the carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration projects that you're seeing as a sort of on-site opportunity to decarbonize or capture emissions. And those new projects or those new technologies are going to require renewable capacity in their own right. So the innovations necessary to sustain the energy transition in South Louisiana are numerous, but I think offshore wind and enabling carbon capture, given so much point source needs with the industrial corridor in our region, is really what's most prominent and of most attention to our and our partners' work.
That makes a lot of sense. So it seems like one of the major projects that you're currently working on is to further facilitate the development of hydrogen while also leveraging offshore wind to be able to feed into that hydrogen. And I know Charles has a few questions on the hydrogen side of things, but before getting into that, would love to hear more about what you're experiencing on the actual implementation side as it pertains to building out the offshore wind infrastructure in Louisiana?
Yeah, so it's been a fast and non-linear journey, right? So just in 2020, we initiated our market development process by developing or encouraging the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to develop a Gulf of Mexico Interregional Task Force, which really was the first stepping stone to our first auction last August. That culminated in a first federal water project with RWE, but also culminated in two unsold areas, which is very uncharacteristic for offshore wind auctions. And it really spoke to the need to address those technology challenges I just referred to, but also an enforceable offtake and procurement. You see states like Massachusetts and others really leading the charge in developing state-led purchase of renewable energy resources. And our market's a little different down in Louisiana.
Oh, so just to hone in on this point, so those two unsold auctions were not sold because the economics did not make sense from an off-taker perspective, as in the electricity that they would have to buy from the offshore wind projects in order to justify the financial feasibility of those projects were just too high.
Ambiguous. There's certainly, per those set of projects I referred to that are all going to need a renewable capacity to operate or operate per, their scope and proposal relevant to supporting decarbonization. Those customers are there. That comes with a little bit more of reliance on business development, and states have really stepped in to create more enforceable targets. So we have a 5 gigawatt offshore wind goal by 2035 set forth in our climate action plan that really connects those coastal issues I was referring to the need to reduce GHG emissions, but it's not enforced or mandated at any level. If you look at New York, for example, they took a look at the cost of carbon and used that to sort of justify the dollar figure they would put towards purchasing renewable resources like offshore wind. And I think in that vein, New York is often looked to as the most sustainable or well-structured market for an offshore wind project, which is one of the more expensive from a capex and investment perspective, as well as operations and maintenance. And so there's customers, but that ambiguity was something that was a little more than for comfort for most developers. I think it's also very much worth noting, though, that those two auction areas were referred to as Texas areas, where they were more situated to serve the Texas market, and beyond ERCOT being its own beast, the Railroad Commission pretty much gave some pretty negative indicators to the developers heading into that auction just 2 days before, with a letter and proposed legislation that would basically restrict any ability for them to get onshore permitting, right? Offshore projects do have an onshore footprint relevant to their substations and further transmission, and they weren't going to get that out of Texas. So the main takeaway is that Louisiana initiated this process. Louisiana left that auction with a successful project. Louisiana is also the only state introducing state water commercial development. So Vestas, Steelhead, their development arm of the largest or second largest wind component manufacturer, is doing a project off of Lake Charles, very close to RWE's.
Very cool.
And then over by New Orleans, we have Diamond Offshore Wind endeavoring similarly a state water commercial wind project. So our portfolio is still 3, and it shows that Louisiana is very interested in being a state leader and not relying on federal auctions or the federal government's pace per se to do this. That said, just last week we actually had our second auction initiated by BOEM through a proposed sale notice of 4 areas. And a main takeaway of that is that of all 15 planned wind energy areas in the Gulf of Mexico, they offered the ones closest to Louisiana, showing that the federal government is sort of following our ambitions to roll out wind energy areas where they will be purchased, where they will be, endeavored for development. Again, on a different timeline than the East Coast for sure, but with some developers that have maybe more of an appetite for risk and a vision for that green hydrogen opportunity. The second auction also carried forward lease stipulations that actually made very clear that offshore green hydrogen production on site of these leases were possible, which was left ambiguous for the first auction, which also might have culminated in how developers showed up or didn't to that first auction as well. And that was certainly a product of advocacy done by GNO Inc. and our partners through the GNO Wind Alliance in interfacing with BOEM's regional office.
Yeah, so critics of hydrogen power will raise a lot of safety issues regarding its flammability and high water consumption. So what's your sort of response to these criticisms, and how do you mitigate these risks?
Yeah, so obviously that becomes its own other area of innovation. So on the pipeline security front, that's definitely going to require new technologies relevant to monitoring pipeline security. but also, right, Louisiana has the most immense pipeline infrastructure supporting LNG and other commodities in the US. So we know how to build them, we know how to maintain them, but there's certainly a justifiable cause for an extra layer of scrutiny on how we're transporting such a volatile and easily escapable molecule, right? It is the lightest molecule, really hard to contain, but a concern that doesn't necessarily warrant pause so much as, again, a next set of innovation to come in and address those challenges. The water consumption piece becomes a little bit more of a nuance between, right, your gray, blue, and green hydrogens, blue referring to that CCUS or sequestration element, which definitely requires a large volume of groundwater used to support the chemical process underpinning it. And then green hydrogen similarly being key to the electrolysis that's using the renewable energy to split the molecules. I think, again, going to circle back to a cause for innovation. Desalination will be a little bit more of a key one relevant to electrolysis, requiring that really pure water to operate. And then, for CCUS, I definitely think it warrants some proper planning around volume of projects and site location. I think these are perfect areas for exploration, research, and innovation relevant to balancing decarbonization being achieved at the front end, but being viewed holistically relevant to biodiversity, environmental resource planning, and community health. So in short, no easy answer to that because it's something that's properly been identified and is a great call to action as these projects get planned to be using the right technologies that address them.
Right, yeah, thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. And from a stakeholder mapping perspective, as you mentioned, there is a pretty well-developed infrastructure in Louisiana because of the LNG pipelines. In terms of how those current stakeholders view green hydrogen, could you provide some insight into what the political landscape looks like?
Yeah, it's very nuanced, right? So I think a big part of the energy transition, and something I'm looking forward to talking about on the panel later, is that we have an immense incumbent energy workforce. So there's the difference between them seeing new energy verticals as a potential threat to their quality of life and way of living, their employment presently. Then on the flip, there's those who have lived around energy production but aren't a part of it and have sort of seen and been harmed by some of those adverse impacts of being such an immense, residing in such an immense hydrogen production or hydrocarbon production area. And so I think there's this balance of those who want to stay participants of the energy sector and are uncertain about these being appropriate bridges or them having a bridge to participate. And that's something we do a lot of work in relevant to workforce development programming. And then there's definitely, again, well-identified and justifiable concerns relevant to the efficacy, some of those safety concerns we just addressed, some of the community planning, and just, again, the early stage of a lot of these technologies don't give a lot of evidence to point to on their efficacy. I think just yesterday, Cypress, which is a large direct air capture project being done by Climeworks and others, is one of the largest and one of two DOE-funded direct air capture projects, and they just released a preliminary community benefits plan that is a very first step at discussing how these projects will inherently need to engage their communities very directly, if not way more directly than was presumed to be the requirement, in the past, because there's a lot of uncertainty. That said, the status quo, the maintaining, the not endeavoring these new solutions are inherently more harmful to the communities, to the coastline, and again, this intersection of the energy transition and the quality of life in Louisiana.
That makes a lot of sense. And wrapping up here, now transitioning to more the personal career journey development side, because I know a lot of listeners look at your career and think it's very admirable and are trying to figure out ways that they can also get plugged in. And as someone who's somewhat recently graduated, I think it's a really important perspective to capture to try and get a sense of how you navigated entering the field and any advice that you would have for people who are currently trying to find a place for themselves within climate.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that sort of like trifold. So one, I couldn't encourage anyone trying to get engaged enough to explore new places. I truly believe South Louisiana to be a ground zero for any of this meaningful work carrying us into the future and really achieving our objectives. We are powering the nation, we're powering the globe. and getting past utilities and grid decarbonization. If we're decarbonizing industry, the things that make the world work, it's going to happen down in the Gulf Coast. And so always encouraging people to come explore opportunities down there. For me personally, I also would encourage people to take the jump and don't feel like you need to have just specialized in from the jump relevant to your education or degree to get engaged with climate. We were talking earlier about my past work being in biotech acceleration and the surrounding economic development. And I got engaged in offshore wind through bringing an international delegation through Louisiana to learn about new energy. And I was like, this seems so exciting and well aligned with an opportunity for change. I saw an open position and I jumped for it. And I just put in the work to read and learn and really network. I will say the renewable energy community, the climate community, is very community oriented. I've learned so much from meeting people in conferences and just not being so shy as to just put yourself out there as a young professional to ask for some insight, help, direction, and ideas. And then third, I would say that I love working on our workforce development programs because climate and energy and renewable energy is so multidisciplinary. It's not just the skilled trades, it's not just working on the plant, it's business, it's finance, it's policy, it's government. So it's also very likely that if you've been trained or educated or professional in some other sector, you can charter that course towards, aligning that with your passion or interest in making some change. So, again, maybe circling back to the networking to help you find that, but it's definitely out there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for
Of
your
course.
time, Cam, and sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.